Welcome to this third Bartlett School of Planning public lecture for the year. If you've been here before, you'll know that my name is Nick Gallant and I convene these public lectures. If you haven't been before, then probably that was news to you. So our public lecture series have been going for about 15 years. And really they're an opportunity to bring interesting speakers from the worlds of practice and academia before us as an audience, and for them to regale us about very topical planning issues and offer their analysis. So I will introduce tonight's speakers in a moment, but so far this year the series has comprised a lecture from Tom Moore at Liverpool University on community land trusts as a housing solution in rural areas. We heard from Dan Ringelstein from Arup on lifestyles and densities in suburban settings from the international projects of the Arup group. And after tonight, we have two more lectures this year. The one after this will be on the 13th of March, delivered by Lauren Andrus from the Bartlett School of Planning, and that will focus on adaptable and temporary urbanisms. Then in May, we're expecting to hear from Kim McGuinness from the North East. She's the Metro Mayor for the North East, and we'll talk about infrastructure planning and regional devolution. So we try to mix academic input and also practitioner perspectives. So Kim will actually deliver this year's Peter Hall lecture in May. So to tonight, it's a bonus evening, actually. We have two speakers, both from the Town and Country Planning Association. Many of you will already know them and will already know their works. But for those of you who don't, let me firstly introduce Katy Locke to my left. Katy is Director of Communities and Project Delivery and also Osborne Fellow at the Town and Country Planning Association. Her recent work has focused on drawing out transferable lessons from the post-war new towns, which of course is the focus this evening. Katy is a chartered town planner and prior to joining the TCPA, worked in the private sector. Katy is also a planning aid for London trustee and a design review panellist for Design South East. And then on the other side of Katy, we have Hugh Ellis. Hugh is policy director at the TCPA and leads on policy briefings and engagement with central and local government, a task which he thoroughly enjoys. Hugh has worked closely with different political interests on successive rounds of planning legislation, culminating in last year's Levelling Up and Regeneration Act. Hugh is currently leading on the promotion of healthy homes legislation and on long-term planning for the climate crisis. Very interestingly, he is Honorary Professor of Utopian Studies at the University of Sheffield, which I think is an absolutely wonderful title. So together, Katy and Hugh are also authors of a book, which I think they brought with them, but you don't have discounted copies for sale this evening.
They're available on the TCPA website.
Oh, they're available,
yeah.
Okay. The Art of Building a Garden City. And also this book, New Towns, Rise, Fall and Rebirth, both published by Reba. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Katy and Hugh. There will be an opportunity in about 45 minutes' time or so for us to engage with them on the topic of tonight's lecture and ask whatever questions we might have. So welcome to UCL, welcome to the Bartlett School of Planning, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you so much, Nick. So we will be doing a double act in which I'm going to make some opening comments, but the central part of this about the extraordinary record in the new towns, Katy's going to present. And I want you all to know that we have rehearsed this perfectly. So it's going to be a seamless presentation. How are we all doing this evening? I've broken the rules, haven't I, and made contact with the audience. How are you doing? What I'm going to do to frame this is just talk a little bit about the TCPA and then a little bit about where the new towns come from. And I'll explain why that's important, because that ambition that the TCPA has about new towns might explain some of the provisional things and ambitions and hope that we have for where we go future for housing provision in this country. I hope everyone's a member of the TCPA. I feel under enormous pressure because our chief exec is in the room, so if I don't say please join now, it's immensely important that you support because we're a small charity, so we need your support to continue our work. And the vision for us is to challenge, inspire, support people to create healthy, sustainable and resilient places, which doesn't seem like much, does it? But in the current context, actually turns out to be quite ambitious. We've been promoting the Garden City Principles, and this gives you a sense of what they are. I'm not going to, you'll be relieved to know, go through them in detail, but they're designed to be an interlocking framework for framing places, ideal places for people to live and thrive. And that's been the core underpinning of our work and the advocacy which Katy's put into the Garden City Principles and which we take forward from Ebenezer Howard's legacy. There is a tremendous, I'm sure there are no students in the room, but if there are, there's a tremendous amount of free advice on the TCPA website. And I think much of what's going to be said tonight, Katy, is sort of based on a lot of hard work and a lot of analysis over the last sort of 10 or 15 years in rediscovering the legacy of new towns. And just before I move on from that, when I was educated, which was a long time ago, I was educated that the New Towns programme was a failure. How many people regard the British New Towns programme as a failure? Let's be honest. Yeah, thank you for your honesty.
So it's a safe space to say that.
Yeah, there's no rights or wrongs here. It's interesting, isn't it, that one of the greatest urban experiments that actually the world's ever known is regarded as that in planning education. In fact, actually, I think, as Katy, you'll reveal, it's an extremely complex story. So all of those resources are there. Please use them. They're freely available. So just a few minutes on the utopian legacy. I've put this image up because this is what happens when you fail to understand what Ebenezer Howard's commitment was to a utopian legacy. When you start to think that human beings and the way they're housed is a product of a macroeconomic theory, you end up housing people like that. I'm in UCL, so you've done all the research on permitted development, and that's the shamefulness of what comes out of that lack of care for human beings and their experience in the built environment. But where we come from is quite the opposite of that. And it's worth just sort of framing that utopian legacy because British utopianism once was a really important cultural idea. But after the New Towns programme, we stopped talking about it. And as we've stopped talking about it, we've lost our ambition for ideal places. And bear in mind that utopianism means ideal, not impossible. And just in that legacy, I think what we've learned and what I've learned far too late in life is that sort of 600-year tradition of putting people and their well-being and the complexity and diversity of the human experience at the heart of how we plan, rather than an economic model and imposing that on the outcomes for how people will live, was the real genius of the British utopian tradition. And every now and again, that tradition that ranged right across from the English Civil War all the way through to the beginning of the Garden City movement was a twofold idea. First was a way of thinking, which was always about challenging current conditions. And in challenging those current conditions, forcing us to be creative about how we can live better with each other, peacefully and sustainably. And the second idea was every now and again to have the nuts concept of building somewhere, which expressed those values. And it's those two ideas in utopianism which were the real driving force of progressive politics. And the reason, in fact, actually we're in the mess we are now is because we lost the ambition of doing both those things, of challenging the status quo and then every now and again building a place which expressed that kind of vision of a different set of social values. The heart and underpinning and moral heart of town planning is progressive. If you don't share those values, you shouldn't be in the planning business. They are absolutely progressive values. That is our DNA, about creating a world which is sustainable, peaceful, and fair, broadly speaking. Where that turns up in all the experiments in the 19th century, many of which, of course, you know about and I won't talk about, turns into that amazing late 19th century process where Howard captured that immense sense of the time. And I'll only say quickly one thing about that, which was that Howard was influenced by an enormous amount of thinking around nature, from Ruskin, from Morris, an immense amount of thinking about anarchist politics. So if you're a planner, you have innate Russian anarchism in your soul, because that's where the Garden City movement came from, through Kropotkin. Don't care whether you like it or not. What did it mean? It meant essentially a support for mutual aid and cooperation, and a mistrust of whether the state would ever do anything. Still fairly have that kind of mistrust. But it was very much a sense of believing in people and their agency. And it's fascinating to me that In thinking about garden cities, Ebenezer Howard was influenced by the Fellowship of the New Life, which turned into the Fabian movement, but the Fellowship, which disappeared, was very much in favour of experimenting and believed in the importance of people's agency. So what is this idea that we've been playing with for all these years? It's about creating a highly sustainable, a fair place, a peaceful place, a place that's about holistic progress in terms of social, economic, artistic progress happening at the same time. And in that sense, it's an absolute rejection of neoclassical economics. And it puts people at the heart of the debate. And it would be as horrified by those pictures as they were by 19th century slums. So the question we've got at the moment is, you think about the relevance of the new towns and why we're so concerned about them. Think about them as a complex set of ideas which flow from that tradition, and particularly the fiercely democratic tradition that went with it. And you can pick out the contradictions in our ideas later on, I'm sure you will, about how you designate new communities. But that concept of them being embedded in people's lived experience is in fact really important. So just in terms of passing over to Katy, we ended up in a process where Ebenezer Howard did an extraordinary thing. Took all those utopian traditions and created an economic model that was able to support brilliant outcomes for people and built Europe's biggest cooperative community at Letchworth Garden City. And the Rochdale pioneers were very much part of the Garden City movement in terms of who influenced who. So it's an idea embedded in those progressive politics, and with an ambition for total placemaking and an ambition, I think, for understanding the human condition. So that's where the utopian legacy takes us, and then it takes us, I guess, into the Garden City tradition. But I'd like you to, because I'm going to bookend this with some practical stuff about where the New Towns unit is going with this. I'll bookend it only by saying, does any of you actually think we have any of that level of ambition for our future in current housing policy in the UK? Or is it simply a housing as a macroeconomic idea, simply a numbers game? So we start with that amazing Garden City legacy.
Thanks, Hugh. I'm going to take you hopefully full circle from that image just there of Harlow, of what is now housing in Harlow, permitted, and industrial estate in Harlow, permitted through permitted development rights, and give you, in the next sort of 15 minutes, a bit of a rattle through of how we got there. As Hugh mentioned, what was really powerful to me about the Garden City movement wasn't just that it was about these great ideas, it's that it was about practical idealism, and they actually got on and built some stuff. So we've already heard about the two garden cities at Letchworth and Welland, and they were fascinating experiments which influenced urban development internationally and continue to do so to this day. But already by about 1918, within the Garden Cities Association, as it was at the time, Frederick Osborne and others were really agitating for the need for the state to get involved in developing new places if actually there was going to be the realisation of these fantastic ideas which they'd been writing about and trying to make happen. There was a real tension between Osborne and Howard in that respect. Howard felt you need to just get on with it. If you waited for the state, you'd be older than Methuselah, he said, before you got on with it. So, but FJO and the New Townsmen led a really powerful campaign. And in the lead up to the Second World War, by the time peacetime arrived in 1945, the government was setting up a New Towns Committee, chaired by Lord Reef, to look in detail at how a new programme of new towns could be built as peacetime arrived. Now, the New Towns programme, the ink was barely wet on the reports of the New Towns Committee when the New Towns Act was passed in 1946. And the Act was part of this post-war settlement, which included the Town and Country Planning Act in 1947. Those and things like the NHS, these were all part of creating a new future for the nation. And the New Towns Act combined this really powerful combination of the designation of land for a new town and the creation of a New Town Development Corporation, which had all the powers and remit to do everything necessary to deliver the town and to deliver the town at speed. It wasn't just about homes, it was about homes and jobs in healthy places, really inspired by the Garden City movement in that respect. But it was a post-war time, so how were they paid for? Well, the new towns at the time were funded by a combination of long-term, low-cost loans from government, the ability to buy land at agricultural use value, or to acquire it rather, agricultural use value for those first wave new towns, as well as the diversion of those other resources which would already be in place for things like education and health. And the New Towns programme would lead to the creation of 32 new towns across the United Kingdom between 1946 and 1970. Now, we wanted to just emphasise, because there was about building homes at speed after the ravages of war, but really importantly, the New Town Development Corporations were tasked with a remit no less than creating opportunities for a whole new kind of citizen, a whole new way of living. They're encouraged to be daring and courageous in discovering a new way of living. Imagine if we had a minister today encouraging us to behave that way when we're thinking about new places. And they were tasked not only building homes and jobs, but creating balanced communities. And that meant investing a huge amount of resource in things like community development, in public art, in the public realm, and in high quality design to make sure these places really put health and well-being at the centre of the places that were being delivered. Now, there's a whole separate talk we could do about the design of the new towns. They are 32 different places which are all distinct in their own ways. They've all had their own histories and stories, positive and negative, and we'll come to some of the lessons from those in a moment. But there has never been, there hadn't been to that point, and hadn't been since, a programme of ambition to create the kind of places which were going to put health and well-being at the centre of how we might live. And each of the 32 new towns were distinct, but there were some common design legacies, things like the use of a master plan to design the new towns, which provided a vision for to enable investment and delivery of the new towns, but provided some flexibility to allow for the creation of new towns over time. Huge investment in green infrastructure, in public realm, in public art, as I've said, but also in the creation of innovative architecture. Like, innovation is a really important and underused word when we talk about garden cities and new towns. If you were a young planner, urbanist, architect at the time, being part of a development corporation in a new town was the most exciting job in urbanism that you could have. The corporations had the resources to attract talent from across the country and from worldwide. And you can see in places distinct as Runcorn and Milton Keynes, where young architects and planners were given whole areas of a new town to deliver and told to go wild. And there's some fantastic built heritage as a result. We'll come back to some of the challenges around that in a moment. But this is really, we just wanted to take a moment to understand how the importance of capturing that ambition of a new way of living. Now, because we don't have all evening to talk about lessons from the New Towns, we're going to skip to the end of the New Towns programme, because it's in this that's some really crucial learning when we think about not how to manage the existing new towns, but thinking about the creation of new towns today. It was actually a bit of a short-sighted policy, the New Towns programme. The Reith Committee had done a huge amount of work on how to design and deliver the new towns, and some on how the development corporations would be wound up. But the policy really didn't set out, and the legislation didn't set out in detail, how the assets of the development corporations would be managed when the programme was wound up. And already by the 1960s, some of the first wave new towns, which had actually been so financially successful they became net lenders to other public bodies, were beginning to wind up, and some of the assets were transferred back to Treasury. The Commission for New Towns was created to take on some of those assets. But there were other changes going on in the country. We'd already had huge inflation, we'd had some civil unrest, and by the time we got to the 1980s, there was huge issues in our urban areas, and policy at the national level really focused to those existing urban areas and how to deal with those issues. And that combined with Margaret Thatcher's government, which came into power and really ordered the immediate wind-up of the New Towns programme. And it's at this point that there was really the betrayal of that vision that Lewis Silkin had laid out for the nation, a new future for the new nation, a new way of living. Because the development corporations, many of which were completely in their infancy, were ordered to wind up with immediate effect. There was a fire sale of their assets. By assets, I mean everything from land and buildings to financial assets to the private sector, and the remaining assets were given over to the host local local authorities, in balancing agreements, mixtures of assets and liabilities. And what this meant is that all of those new towns, which had been encouraged to put a huge amount of emphasis and resource into creating high quality public realm, into public art, into green infrastructure, all these things which are really expensive to manage, their economies became essentially like any other town. So those resources to manage those fantastic assets just weren't there. And there are two examples which show really what the opportunity might have been if the programme hadn't been wound up and if those assets had been managed properly. And really due to the foresight of Development Corporation workers in Milton Keynes, they set up the Milton Keynes Park Trust, which was endowed with some land and some financial assets to manage the green infrastructure in Milton Keynes. And as that was able to manage that financial portfolio and land portfolio as the city developed, they now have the resource to manage the green infrastructure in Milton Keynes to a really, really high standard. The other example was the Nene Valley Park Trust in Peterborough. We will never know how successful the New Towns programme could have been because it was stopped short, but there is a huge amount of learning from that programme. And before I get on to the lessons from that for today, I would just touch on a moment on some of those common challenges and opportunities that we identified. So the work that Hugh mentioned that we started over 10 years ago, when we really wanted to understand what was going on in the new towns today, we got in touch with all of the 32 new town host authorities to understand what was happening in those places today. And although each of them have a very distinct history, and current circumstance, there were some real common challenges and opportunities to learn from. The first here is about the renewal of their town centres and land ownership, and that was to do with the way the assets were sold off with those balancing agreements and with the fire sale of assets to the private sector. Most of the town centres were sold off to the private sector, making regeneration by the local authorities really challenging. And most have this really complex mosaic of land ownership throughout the new towns, which have made it really difficult to manage renewal by the local authorities. The design of the new towns meant there was a focus on positive movement, so fantastic cycleways, pedestrian walking routes, and yes, accessibility by the car. And we know today that has obvious challenges in terms of climate resilience and health and all of those things. But it was really interesting to learn from many of the host authorities said that the new towns in their areas had suffered congestion much later than other towns of a similar age because of the way they had been planned. I mentioned about some of that fantastic built heritage, and it's a real crime because in many of the new towns, the importance of that built heritage has not been recognised and it's simply been bulldozed and lost. It's an absolute crime, and those who are interested in heritage are already campaigning to try and save some of that fantastic public art and architecture which was built by the corporations. But in some of the new towns, places like Harlow and Milton Keynes and Skelmersdale and Craigavon and others, they've recognised the importance of that history and used it as a catalyst for regeneration today, which is really important. The huge emphasis on genuinely affordable housing and social housing in the new towns has also had an impact on the way they are managed and developed today. The impact of external policies, things such as the right to buy, has made the renewal of those estates very challenging, and particularly in the early new towns where the estates were built at speed using quite cheap materials following the Second World War. That's presenting a real regeneration challenge. It's basically really expensive for those host local authorities of having to manage renewal in all sorts of ways. And I've already touched on that issue of stewardship. Some places like Milton Keynes and Peterborough, have managed to set up those arrangements for management of their green infrastructure and public realm. But in many of the new towns, that's just not been financially possible, or there hasn't been the political or financial will to do it. And as a result, many of the new towns are not in a good condition, and that's why there has been for decades such a negative perception of what these places are like to live in. What was really fantastic was talking to people that lived in the new towns, and people were very actually protective of talking about them. And actually, I should admit, I was born and raised in Milton Keynes, so I've been an advocate for it my whole life. But it's really interesting talking to people that actually lived in the new towns about their experience, and you can read about that in our research. So I'm sure I've been talking for too long already. I'm going to just touch on these key lessons, which are really important for when we're thinking about creating new towns today. And I'll go through these just really quickly, one by one. The first is about site identification and the essential need for a strategic approach to identifying locations. It was an absolute myth that all of the locations of the post-war new towns were identified by government, this sort of famous cartoon here of the ministers throwing darts at maps. In fact, when we actually looked into the history of each of the new towns, the majority of them had come forward as the result of campaigning by local politicians. There had been sub-regional studies of huge urban conurbations, but also of some of the smaller towns to understand what the future housing options were for those places. And what the New Towns Act did is provided a strong offer and a clear national policy from government to de-risk it for those local leaders to come forward and say, actually, can you make this happen in our area? And that's something we really need to learn from today. But today we also have the issues of the need to consider the climate emergency and health and well-being when we're thinking about our strategic approach to locations. We have looked in detail at the Newtown Development Corporation model. The New Towns Act 1981, as was last consolidated, is still on the statute books, and with a few amendments in relation to public participation in terms of climate resilience and in terms of stewardship, it could be made fit for purpose and used tomorrow. There are several different types of development corporation. It's Newtown development corporations that we believe are the most effective way to deliver these larger scale new communities. Creating a new town or a new city is a unique and complex task. It's unlike any other task in urbanism, and so it requires a specific tool for the job. And many of the attempts that have happened in recent years have simply been using the wrong tool to try and make these high standards happen. The third is about the money. The New Towns programme essentially paid for itself. There were challenges, particularly in terms of rising inflation, but the 60-year fixed rate loans from government, I think it was 5.6 billion, I can't remember the figure entirely, they were repaid with interest by 1996, and there's land in the New Towns which still continues through quite perverse, I think, covenants on bits of land in the new towns, which still provide some income for Treasury, and a lot of that land is still owned by Homes England and is being developed by them in some places too. New towns can be highly profitable for government, but it relies on a number of tools, including land value capture, but really importantly, upfront investment and a commitment to national policy to de-risk it for the public and private sector to invest, and it requires a long-term patient approach to make that happen. I've talked about stewardship. We've been doing a lot of work on long-term stewardship at the TCPI. If you're interested in it, please do check out the work we've been doing on our website in relation to this. Is absolutely the crux of how we can make the high-quality places and healthy places that we want today to actually happen. We know that the right model can actually provide the resources to pay for and maintain places at high quality in the long term, but also, really importantly, can help make sure people are embedded in the process of community development and of developing the new towns themselves, a really strong sense of community participation. Which brings me to this point about people being at the heart of decision making. Now, the early New Towns programme provided very little public participation. There's a fantastic photograph of when Lewis Silcombe went to Stevenage and the local people changed the railway sign to Silkingrad. There was a huge amount of opposition. As we say in here, actually, there was a lot of opposition for the first wave new towns, which were actually Conservative authorities and perhaps didn't want to have Labour voters coming to live in their area. So there's a lot of complex politics around identifying these locations as well. But the New Towns programme was from 1946 to 1970 in terms of that designation, and there was real learning in that. So by the time we get to Milton Keynes, there was consideration of how people in those existing 12 villages felt about the new community that was coming. Some of you in this room might know better than I do about wider research on how public perception changes of new development and large-scale development in new towns. But I think that it feels like that would be something to be really worthwhile having more research on, because we couldn't find that much when we were doing our work. But what we are really sure about, having done our work on Tomorrow 125 and the Garden Cities, is that a new programme of new towns must have people at the heart of decision making, and we've set out ways to do that, which Hugh will touch on in a moment. But that really we need a national conversation about the need for homes and the need for genuinely affordable and healthy homes in this country, because people need to be brought along with government in any changes that are happening, and that's something which seems to be missing so far. And finally, in terms of these lessons, it's about the way places are designed. And we know that we need innovation in the way we design and build homes. But it was really interesting going to talk to people that had lived in some of the new towns. And this picture here is Peter Lee, and it's an estate that was designed under the leadership of Victor Pasmore. And it looks fantastic. If you're a fan of modernist architecture, as I am, these beautiful RIBA pictures, they look gorgeous to me in those images. But actually, what people reported was that they were really cold and hard to insulate, and the flat roofs didn't really suit the climate of the northeast or in Cumbernauld of the lowland Scotland. So while we need to make sure, it's really important that we put quality, health and well-being at the centre of the way we design places today, alongside sustainability, and that should be given priority over the speed and experimentation that we know there is such appetite for as well. And I'll hand over to Hugh now, who's going to talk a bit about the white paper we published last year. We took all of this learning and we set out the practical steps that we think government needed to take to unlock housing delivery. So over to you, Hugh.
Thanks very much, Katy. And there's a great sight to be seen of me and Katy going around new towns bickering with each other about whether the modernist architecture was a good idea or not. So if you could see two people doing that, you'll know it's us. That legacy of the new towns is something that we've been arguing about and trying to suggest to government that taking a strategic approach to meeting the housing crisis through highly sustainable new communities was the thing to do. At the beginning of the year, we were responding, I suppose, to the last government's incredibly ideologically driven anti-planning agenda, essentially, which is that we apparently are the problem and the enemy of enterprise. And we published a paper, I suppose, that tried to set out how you could fix that through a process of sustainable new communities. But there were some provisos that came out of the lessons in that, particularly about democracy, leaning into the fact that if you're going to have a designation process, you're going to have a Rolls-Royce process of engaging people, that you need a national conversation. And although my comments about utopia at the beginning might have seemed completely irrelevant, perhaps they were, the point about that, I suppose, is that you can't break the governance rule. You have to have a conversation with people in this country. And the current approach, the last government's approach, and indeed, unfortunately, this government's approach, is to think that you can impose a technocratic solution on planning on people and places in a very densely populated and still instinctively democratic country. And it can't be done. So the process of doing it going forward into the future is going to mean a whole new approach to governance. In fact, that probably is the biggest challenge, I think, in taking this forward. Because if you get it wrong, the backlash, of course, brings down your strategic approach to planning, and it brings down the new town's ideal. If you're going to have a very strong instrument like a development corporation, it has to lean into the new methods of participative democracy that we're kind of all familiar with. So we published the white paper and we essentially said there are two problems, and then neither of them are town planning. The lack of town planning causes housing crisis, but the principal reasons for it were the fact that we rely completely on private sector delivery, and absorption rate mean that they will never build at a rate that meets need or at a price that meets need. And that's an enormous challenge, and in fact we have no strategic approach. The biggest issue of all is investment in social rent. If you want to solve the housing crisis, somebody has to pay for it. And private sector has no incentive to do that. So government has got to be clear about it, that it's very difficult to see how private sector money will feed into this. And I think that challenge is something we might quickly come back to before we finish. So we set out that vision for new communities. We set out all of the issues that have to go with it. It's amazing in the New Towns programme and the Wreath reports how smart they were about supply chain. It's kind of important if you're going to start building large-scale new communities. How is our modern methods of construction industry doing in this country at the moment? Not great is the answer. But of course you can, if you built a new town, of course you could build one or two, and people have offered to do it, pop-up factories to manufacture modular housing for new towns. There's an immense opportunity if you're going to plan over the long term in a counter-secular way with public investment to promote innovation in the way that we design, in the way that we all know we have to do. So there's a whole series of measures that we took out in terms of modernising delivery bodies, supporting local government, and the designation process of financing, which I'd like to come back to just really briefly, because I think the current government, or certainly Treasury, thinks that the private sector can finance these places, and that's an interesting question we might debate. And then, of course, ultimately enabling that legacy and stewardship. I think in a wise conversation, Katy, you were once concluded that about 1% of the challenge was designated in building them, and 99% is how you manage places, is it not? And I think the vandalism at the end of the programme illustrates that really well. So the New Communities Group is interesting. Now, I'm not going to advocate for the New Communities Group particularly, but it is a group of local authorities building at scale. When we talk about big these days, we're talking about between 1,500 and 10,000 homes. But mostly at the bottom end of that scale. And that's primarily because of really practical issues. Again, I think the current debate misses, like flood risk and infrastructure provision and all the basic things that are essential to building a place for which, of course, we've had no plan for 5 or 6 decades in this country. So it's very difficult to suddenly pull them out or pull a rabbit out of a hat. But it's interesting to me that there is that ambition and local authorities have been leading on it. I get so frustrated with central government. I mean, essentially, my thesis is that Westminster is a place where ideas go to die. I don't mean the local authority, I mean national government. And actually, there's an immense amount of innovation, despite the kicking that planning and local government gets all the time by central government. This stuff is coming locally up. And that ambition around that needs to be supported and enabled. And we could have another debate about what they need, couldn't we, in terms of their support. So let's just talk finally and quickly about the work of the New Towns Task Force. We campaigned for it. It was fantastic that it's set up. It was set up, last time I was told 3 months ago, but that seems to be a movable feast. I thought it was set up in July, but it's due to do an interim report in the summer. And the New Towns Task Force is designed to advise government on a new generation of places, and you can see on the website the ambition for that. I'm just going to pick out some elements of that you might want to pick up. It's of 10,000 homes and above. Interesting that, isn't it? I suspect that the first sort of discussions around it were very much about an assumption that urban extensions were much easier to do than new settlements. My challenge to you all is that true? I wonder. So the scale issue is one, and the ambition issue is one. Likely to be development corporation led, but the question therefore is, could you have private sector funded development corporations? Basically, we've just come here so you can answer all these questions for us, but there are, as you can imagine, serious issues about how that works, aren't there, in terms of what does the private sector want for its investment stream. At the same time, enormous amount of patient investment and capital out there looking for a home. So does this provide that kind of opportunity? The issue that's focused, I think, on development corporations is I think we're having less success on the governance question. Fascinating how in a democracy nobody wants to talk about democracy. And interesting, I think, that there is still this idea, which he said, you know, was essentially where the Fabian movement was at for quite a time, which is that you can impose and democracy really isn't much of a problem. Kind of is, I think. Over and above housing numbers. So the idea is that local authorities will bring these forward over and above very demanding housing numbers. Kind of breaks the contract that Milton Keynes was committed to, because as Katy said, it was locally led. But the idea behind Milton Keynes was this solves your housing crisis and housing need and all the controversy that goes with trying to find the sites for a generation or two. I mean, probably Milton Keynes' case, maybe 3 generations. So that doesn't work, and ministers have got that wrong. We need to say that. If you're going to sell this idea to local people, it has to be about trying to say, let's end all the argument in this sub-region and let's do something really brilliant with a 30 to 40 year lifespan. Also, I would just say that, you know, in the white paper, you know, in the MPPF that was published, housing numbers that aren't based on demographics are nuts, and we need to call that out. And the demographics aren't there anymore. That's crazy. Focus in areas of high demand. We're in London, I think. There is apparently another country out there. The general consensus seems to be this is all about London and the South East and the greater South East. And the original New Towns programme was innovative, isn't it? Wasn't it, in industrial modernisation? The one I almost love it the most because of course it's got all the modernist architecture in it is Peter Lee, and Peter Lee was about creating a utopia for miners. And you've got to love that ambition, haven't you? Does the north of England get any of this? Or maybe we should finish Peter Lee off because it never was finished. Skelmersdale the same, huge opportunity. You can't sell this politically, can you, if it's just about Oxford, Cambridge and the South East? So focus of areas of high demand is controversial. Using private capital we could talk about. And there is currently a call for sites, for evidence for sites. I have to be careful what I say. And I would just say we've got so much learning from the Ecotowns programme. Anyone remember the Ecotowns programme? The last time government said, we'll pull a rabbit out of a hat and say, there you go. And it fell off the rails so fast you can't imagine. And it fell off the rails because they invited sites to come forward in a competitive process without one crucial thing, public local consent of any kind in the process. And the backlash was instant and it was pervasive and it wore the government out. And in the end, it crashed and burned. There are notable examples of people who've rebranded from eco-towns to garden communities, and Bicester is one of those places. So where the New Towns Task Force goes is an interim report in the summer. We remain absolutely fervently optimistic that they're going to do something gloriously utopian, but we're going to be applying a really rigorous and fierce test. Because if you are going to do this in this country, it's got to be brilliant. It's got to be an outstanding example of the very best that we can achieve at this time. It's got to echo back the reflection that when you build, you have to build in a way that meets that basic human need and delivers for the future. What an opportunity it would present if you get it right. But what a disaster it would be if it's a bolt-on urban extension and more of the same car-dependent and very substandard housing, and God forbid, more PDR. So we have all the technical design skills to do it. It's not a technical issue. It's primarily an issue of politics and political will. There isn't a single issue. I ask you, could you think we could build a community of 10,000 passive house homes?
In this country, never. But it's not meant to. The English are to freeze in their 19th century homes because that is all they are allowed to do in this country.
Excellent. I'll take that as a response. But I reckon we could. And the point is, technically, we can. And the issue, I suppose, about that is whether we want to, and whether culturally we want to, and whether we're focused on delivering it. But the question is that is the challenge, because if we don't, we're building a problem. And then we published optimistically, and if you want to look at it, about health, hope and prosperity, we tried to capture some of this, and I know we've talked about the health agenda, but just finally we tried to capture some of the learning from the NHS Healthy New Towns, and also the ambition we have around health and well-being. And just as I come to the end, it's worth reflecting that, the kids in Letchworth Garden City in the 1920s were about 1.5 inches and about half a stone heavier than the kids from inner city Birmingham. Those early utopian pioneers of garden cities had an instinctive feeling about the spiritual value of nature and the benefits to people's health. It was just something that was implicit. Now, of course, we've got how much tonnage of evidence about the relationship of people and the environment and nature and good placemaking that can actually be the foundation of good lives. So we set this out, and that's our challenge to the New Towns Task Force. Are you going to do good? You're going to build something really ambitious? Or is this going to be a numbers game? In other words, just a manifestation of another piece of macroeconomic policy that puts people and housing at the end of the equation and not at the heart of it. So there's loads more on the TCPA website if you would like to look at it. A great deal of kind of research about that, and if there's any questions, I've lost Nick, he's there. We're really happy to pick him up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for a whole string of provocations. We have an opportunity now to ask questions. I think the format we'll take is I'll come around with a roving mic. I'm not just the chair tonight, I'm also sort of the general dog's body. So I'll come around with this mic. We'll take a couple of questions, and then I'll give Katy and Hugh the opportunity to respond. So any takers?
Hi, thanks for that. That was really interesting. I want to pick up on something you said, Hugh, about MMC, especially volumetric modular, which has all but collapsed in this country. I think there's only one viable house builder that is able to use that. There was an MMC inquiry last year where a lot of the providers sort of complained that the issue why they weren't able to continue was because they didn't have stability of pipeline. If they were to go well, new towns would, take decades by the government's own admission. Would that be enough to stimulate? I mean, volumetric modular it kind of seems, especially because there were a lot of passive house options out there, could that re-stimulate the demand enough to have some support to that sector, these 10, 20-year pipelines?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are two factors in that. I mean, the government wants to seed the market with permissions, but to be really clear, we're already consenting 100,000 more permissions for housing every year than we build. The principal issue about that is whether the private sector has the incentive to build or the incentive to modernise, and that's partly because we've deregulated too far. I think the issues about modern methods of construction are complex, so there's a dependency here. The dependency is, what is the scale and ambition for the government for our New Towns programme? And is it really true that it takes decades? Because the evidence is it doesn't. So the evidence from designation to on-site, 46, 47, 18 months to 2 years. And then, of course, you've got a development corporation which transforms the economics of viability. And that's really, you enter a different economic landscape with a development corporation, where viability is not uncertainty. So the New Towns offered an ability through public investment to work in a counter-secular way economically that enabled the private sector to actually have because the private sector was building these places on the whole, to have a certainty of production. But that depended, I think, really crucially on investment in social rent from government, to be really honest, to make that happen. Somebody had to pay. So if you're only going to build 1.5 urban extensions at 10,000 homes, the answer is no. If you're going to designate 10, 12 places at 35,000 homes, then the answer is probably yes. It certainly puts you in a better position than the one we're in at the moment.
And opportunities for the development corporations to take a direct role in that provision as well, as part of that confidence.
Yeah.
So my strategy of 2 questions at a time broke down entirely, right from the beginning. But I think we had another question over here. Yeah.
Why does your research completely ignore the most successful practitioners of new towns in the world, which is Korea, Japan, and China? They managed to do it with the private sector, with a lower rate of social housing, I would add, than even under the Section 106 post-1990 world we've been in. You're basically asking us to follow after the American New Town experiments in the 60s, the single most incompetent New Town program in the bloody world. Why did you not talk about what's going on in Seoul, Greater Seoul right now? With Seongnam and the giant industrial site on the port I always forget the name of, near Incheon. Why don't you talk about them? They're successful. They have high transit use. They have higher incomes relative to the national average. Peter Lee is what you get when you try and build another failed 19th century style community just with modernist architecture. So why did you have such an insular book and research project? You've got to learn from foreign examples, because this country cannot build and will not build because it's an insular, failed, great power. Sorry.
Thank you very much. So why can't we be more like Southeast Asia?
Well, firstly, there is...
Sorry, East Asia. I do apologise. Why can't we be more like East Asia?
There is a huge amount of learning internationally, and that's something the TCPA has been looking at, our new communities.
Sorry. Let them answer, please.
Our New Communities group goes on lots of international trips, particularly to Europe. So there's lots of learning from the Netherlands and from Denmark, which is in a lot of our earlier research, looking at different ways to manage land, different ways to manage stewardship, different ways to manage that delivery and design. And I think one of the challenges is transferring that learning into the complex and broken housing delivery model that we've got and the politics of this country specifically. And so there is some of our research that looks into that. This book was specifically about
the same problem we are, just of a lesser sort. Right? They both have horrendous housing prices because the social housing model breaks down because homeowners will never give you enough money. Never. If they would, someone would have already done it. No one's done it. And don't say Netherlands in the 1960s. Or Denmark, or Sweden.
Thank you. Okay, so if you'd like to respond to that, but then we'll
you
move
know
on
what?
to
You
another
know what?
question.
Actually, I've reached an age where I'm not sure I do want to respond to that level of aggression, so I may not. But the challenge is a good one. We were asked to write a book about the British New Towns, so we wrote a book about the British New Towns. The issue for us, I think, is that there is an important legacy that comes out of the British tradition, and we don't claim to be writing a global analysis of new towns, which is really important. And the most important part of that, I think, that we've discovered, which is inspiring, is about the limitations of the market, It's about the opportunity to take a different approach that was embedded in the Garden City movement and the importance of learning. If you read the book, I think what we're really disciplined about is pointing out where the mistakes were made. And in understanding those mistakes, seeing what could be applied to a new programme of new towns and understanding the learning that comes out internationally as well. But at the heart of it, there is a very peculiar tradition, a very peculiar British tradition, which has some relevance. And that relevance is, how do you live through a climate crisis in the 21st century in a way which is caring, which is sustainable, and which is fair? And what we can be absolutely clear about it is that neoliberal economics doesn't deliver that. So what is our alternative going to be to that?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm interested in hearing more about the work of the New Towns Task Force. You were picking up on some points there of things that you're discussing. One of them was about development corporations, and you had a question mark. So in a way, you were saying the task force is thinking about what type of development corporation, like looking back at all the different iterations of agreements, governance arrangements that we have seen in terms of development corporations. You mentioned something about the private sector perhaps playing a bigger role, and that's where I was thinking, has there been any discussion or thinking around locally led development corporations? Because they have been introduced now with the Levelling Up Regeneration Act. Local authorities might have an opportunity there to have a bigger say on how these new towns are created. I don't know. I wanted to know more about what sort of development corporations the government is thinking, that the task force is thinking about. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I could talk about that.
So I think the task force is involved in quite an active discussion about whether it's new town or whether it's locally led, and the general sense is it probably will be the locally led model. I think as a piece of background, the problem for us is that the new towns legislation is much amended and now has a whole series of, as you know, hybrids from mayoral development corporations all the way through to urban development corporation models, all of which were spawned by the original model. But the law has become incredibly complex. So I asked a group of civil servants if they could write down, kind of what it all meant, and nobody actually can. The pivotal difference, our concern, which Katy might pick up, is that new town development corporations offered the most powerful and unequivocal route. And they do one thing that locally led doesn't do. They bind central government to support the outcome. Locally led new town development corporation shifts the responsibility from Secretary of State, permanent secretary, to local authority. And if you are serious about private sector investment, then you can imagine private investors going, so you're an almost bankrupt local authority embarking on this versus HMT. And it's maybe about confidence. So there's a really active debate about how they can be fused together, or how you might be able to get the best of both worlds out of that.
I just wondered if instead of focusing on new towns and large urban extensions, whether you think there's any merit in more modest scale developments. I'm thinking of park homes, which have apparently become quite fashionable. I think one of the problems we have in Britain is that in Victorian times we built very large homes of brick and stone, etc. And I wonder if that's an outmoded idea now, when you look at the appetite there is for executive style large houses, luxury houses. And we have, increasingly maybe far too much space, or more space than we require in our homes. And we ought to be just downsizing and maybe also changing materials, etc., to make these things, more sustainable.
Let's start with that. I mean, I think there's a wider conversation there about the types of homes that we need in the new places we develop. I mean, what we've actually set out in the white paper is that absolutely there's a whole portfolio of solutions that we need, not just whole new places, but we also need renewal of our existing areas. And there's a huge also role for local plan-led, smaller scale development, and we would encourage that to consider some of the Garden City principles and things, those different ways of, for example, community-led homes as well in some of that smaller scale development. So, but the thing about new towns is they are large places. They are not just one single entity. They are living ecosystems of places and neighbourhoods, each of which is likely to be distinct or should be distinct and include a range of homes. I think one of the challenges I think you set out, and something that should be put to the task force or those development corporations that are delivering them, is how can you design places, homes which are going to be adaptable and stand the test of time, to remain healthy and useful and safe through the over 100 years, and that's an ongoing learning process, I think.
Okay, great. We've got a few more questions. I'll come to the centre.
I'm actually doing a PhD right now. I just started in October, focused on new towns. Actually, reading your book was something that inspired me a lot to focus on that topic. Initially looking at community stewardship as a focus, but shifting gradually towards more of that public perception and narrative issue that you were talking about and how important that is. I know the TCPA is also involved in the New Towns Task Force, right? I noticed there's a lot. There seemed like there would be a lot of conflicting interests in there as well, given that there's both public sector and private sector actors on the task force. But you're saying it has more of an advisory role. So, how have you seen those interests play out, or do you think could potentially cause an issue?
Yeah, fascinating question. Is it conflicted? I think it absolutely is conflicted. And I think the more that we reflect on the new government's approach, which is essentially to say, so Keynesianism is out, no New Deal. This is about how you create an environment for private sector investment to deliver public goods. Discuss, everybody, if you'd like to, challenging though that is. It's absolutely fascinating to see how they square this circle. And if at the heart of this is the lesson that Katy pointed out, which is that the post-war Labour government said, these places pay for themselves if you provide the upfront investment and the loans necessary to do that. And then they'll pay back. If you don't want to do that anymore, and interestingly, those changes to the way that PSBR is calculated, that was introduced, could make that easier for government. That could be groundbreaking. But if Treasury still won't put any money in, then you're reliant in big private sector investment funds trying to do that. And then the question becomes, what do they want for that in terms of the price paid for quality? So I think that the challenge is that there are those conflicts. But my God, in the current environment, some part of me, us, has to travel hopefully. And when you think about some of the voices that are on, there are some brilliant urban designers, there are some people involved in social housing, there's some smart voices on that task force, which is why we're going to be in the summer publishing a new prospectus for a garden city, which is going to be as ambitious as we possibly can be about the quality, because we just need to push them hard. But your question is right, and fascinating for research. When you write the book about it, as I'm sure you will in 3 years' time, you'll be able to look back and see how that played out.
We should perhaps mention another forum as well, which is the All-Party Parliamentary Group on New Towns, which TCPA is secretariat for and was originally established with Lucy Allen, the MP for Telford, and that is still going. It's had a rebirth again with the new government, and that's looking at lessons from the existing new towns for the renewal of those existing places, as well as lessons for a new generation of new towns. So there'll be some activities with the APPG in the next year too, so worth checking that out.
Thank you. I agree with almost everything that you've said, and I wanted to echo particularly Katy's remark at the beginning about how conditions in the 60s and 70s were conditions in which young planners coming from their education would aspire to nothing more than working for a new town corporation. Because when I graduated as a student from this school in 1966, my first work was working on the master plan for Milton Keynes, and it was absolutely the most wonderful experience, despite all sorts of problems. And the main thing that I look back on with pleasure and pride is doing the analysis which persuaded the board that they couldn't do it all with privately developed owner occupation. They had to build half of it as social housing at regulated rents. Otherwise, they would never achieve the kind of social mix and industrial mix that they aspired to. And that finally succeeded, and I feel terribly pleased about that. But thinking about all that in relation to today's discussion, I think one thing that we need to acknowledge is that the distribution of income and wealth in Britain is now so incredibly unequal that if we're asking the private sector to do something about resolving the affordability problems of housing, it's kind of almost inconceivable that they could do it. I mean, what private investor is going to be interested in building housing for people whose level of poverty and need is as severe as it is for the poorest third, say, of current British residents? It's a completely new situation, and it makes it very difficult to make international comparisons because we are in such an extreme situation. So my main comment is that in all this, we've got to think of ways of coping with the level of inequality which we have in the country in coping with housing and so on. So thank you very much. It's a very interesting discussion. I'd only really ask one question, and that is, do you think that land value capture through the new towns kind of machinery, namely buying at agricultural prices or low prices, is going to give enough space, enough latitude, enough development value in the public ownership to allow these extreme problems of inequality to be tackled? Is it a strong enough instrument?
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that when they were first designated, you got new towns with 97% social rent as the tenure, and places ultimately which paid for themselves, even though they were 97% social rent. But I think the issue about land value capture and equality is that new towns are another instrument for redistribution. You have to work out whether you believe in wealth redistribution or not, up to an extent. The question is, I think, whether or not there is enough value in land to be able to do it all. And the answer to that question is, I'm not sure there ever was. It's also about other income streams, isn't it? The land value capture is the heart of it, but you're also gaining future income streams from rents, from leases, which was the heart of the Garden City model. So there's a sophistication to it, I think, that we're beginning to understand. But the answer to that question is partly framed by Labour's consultation at the moment on CPO, which ends in mid-February, which is about hope value and the way that hope value essentially destroyed the New Towns programme. So although the vandalism about the way the programme was wound up by the Thatcher government in '79 is one element of it, what happened, I think, in changing to the compensation code starting in 1956 meant that rather than being able to purchase at current use value, agricultural value in that case, based on the 39 valuation, you started to have to buy in building hope value. And hope value is an extraordinary benefit to landowners that they haven't earned and don't deserve. So it's basically saying, well, in valuing the compensation when you compulsory purchase, I might have got planning permission on this land for something in the future, and therefore you owe me money for it. And that effectively destroyed from the 1960s the ability of new towns to pay back loans in the way that they were doing. Now, the Labour government is suggesting, and in fact the last government already moved to some degree in this direction, that hope value be heavily constrained. And that does create an opportunity. But at the end of the day, you still have to bend into a new town development corporation direct subsidy for social rent. Otherwise, you'll never achieve the level of equality that we need to achieve in these new places. And if that ambition isn't there, my fear is that all you do is simply come out the other end of it with a very effectively delivered reinforcement of current inequality in the way that we deal with housing.
Without sounding like a dinosaur, it has always been my impression that for local authorities to engage projects requiring capital expenditure of this scale, it's necessary to not freak out their Section 151 officers. Secretary of State aside, because when you do go ahead with different corporation, you need to file for their consent, and they will consult Treasury. Treasury is an all answer itself. Anyway, how can you mobilise local authorities to commit to projects of this nature? When now we have heard so many horror stories in the last few years that building and development project driving councils to issue Section 114 notices. How can you persuade the auditors and their Section 151 officers that they have the necessary competence engaging this path fraught with commercial risks they're in no way familiar with?
Mm-hmm. I think it's this understanding that the right legislation and national policy just changes the game, really. It's a completely different delivery model to that's been available to local authorities for the last few decades in terms of building projects at scale. It means a commitment from government to de-risk the process for investing and building these places at scale over a long period of time, which is just not a model that has been available to authorities for the last few decades. So the right offer from government to de-risk that investment is what makes that possible.
Sorry.
Have you tried to do a costing?
So the last time there were costings were things, well, Wolfson Prize produced costings from various people about how it could be done through private means, for example. But this time round, that's really the crux of what the debate is between the New Towns Task Force and the Treasury. And it gets to the heart of your question about where financial responsibility will sit between central and local government and where that will be financed from.
If you rely on cross-subsidies model, which I assume you are, to attract private investment in New Town, you are assuming that the agents driving the change have necessary competence to deal with these commercial risks. Local authorities have necessary commercial skill set to actually deliver a new town. Well, if we learn anything from the local housing companies and stuff like that, we would say that 60% of them, conservatively, don't know what they're doing when they're going ahead building stuff.
And I think that is why a New Town Development Corporation is our preferred model, not a locally led New Town Development Corporation. But there is a very important, I mean, not that Westminster governments do nuance very well, they certainly do not. But there is a magic moment between the governance of locally led, about the inspiration and the ask, which is the Milton to Keynes model, bolted together with a Secretary of State and HMT standing behind the debt. Even if HMT is standing as a lender of last resort behind the debt of a development corporation, then the chances of getting lower cost finance from the private sector increases. None of this, by the way, is easy. It's the most complex job, as Katy said, in the world. But that's why the Development Corporation is and trying to get Whitehall to understand the economics of development corporations is very difficult, because what comes back, because what we're told in this country is that markets deliver, but they can't deliver good because it wouldn't be viable for them. I always find that argument, interesting. What we're saying is viability is transformed.
Locally, the CPOs, new powers.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, let's just imagine, if you were starting again, you wouldn't start from here. You could build, I think, a brilliant development corporation model if you had the freedom to think freely about what it needed to do in the 21st century.
And the skills to do it, and you and Michael's point really highlights this issue about skills, which we did put in the white paper, but the skills to do this are required at all levels, and there is a lot of investment in promotion of the need for skills in planning and urbanism, but for this to actually happen, there needs to be significant investment in that right now.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk. And hopefully this links quite well to what you've just been talking about. I haven't actually read your white paper, but I think I will, obviously, following this. What I was really interested about is, we talked a lot about all the factors, but we know at the moment that the government doesn't have a roadmap really in place. Nobody sees a viable roadmap for the delivery. So I was just interested, is this in your white paper? Have you set out a process? Have you set out steps, action points involving skills, a timeline? We've said, hey, we can deliver housing in 2 years. Well, can we put pressure on the government? Can we, is that in your white paper? Will that be in a future white paper?
We have made an attempt at that in our white paper, and I think in terms of timescales, we said that there could be a report within 12 months to identify areas of search for potential new locations within which government would support locally led processes to identify specific locations and scale. And we have set out that roadmap, which includes supply chains, it includes skills, it includes identifying really strong standards for health and wellbeing and quality from the outset as well. Whether the New Towns Committee will listen or not remains to be seen, but all we can do at this point is keep promoting that information and be hopeful.
Yeah, and if it's interesting, there's sort of a follow-up conversation we've been having about, well, what would the locational criteria be for these new places? And I think for us it was always very important that you had a sense of a national spatial framework, national plan, whatever you care to call it, which actually said where should these places go and where's the join between key bits of infrastructure, and is it sensible to focus massive amounts of development in Cambridge when there's rather an issue with water, which seems like a very basic locational criteria for places.
That's also the first place the New Towns Task Force seems to have visited, so it's interesting.
So join the dots.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks very much. I really enjoyed your talk. I'm Georgia from University of Brighton. As you know, I have a keen interest in new towns, and I'm particularly interested in what you were saying about new towns as legacy. And I really feel it's important that new towns are seen as a very special part of Britain's town planning heritage. And I think when most people refer to heritage, they probably don't think of modernist architecture or new towns. And obviously the 20th century society and yourselves, you know, are flying the flag for it. But I feel that it's a really important part of protecting new towns because, as you were saying earlier, so many have been, you know, really harmed, or parts of town centres have been destroyed from new sort of clone town type development, really, I think, a sort of anywhere, any town type development. So I just wondered what your thoughts are about how we can get that sort of buy-in, how we can start to properly recognise them as a very unique and special type of, you know, social utopia, as I know you've referred to before. And I'm putting on an exhibition of Crawley post-war photographs in February, and of course you'll get a private view invitation taken by Wolf-Szycki in 1959. And we really want local people to realise, you know, how special these places are, and in them, you know, to themselves start to feel valued. Because I think as Colin Ward once said, you know, because of that underinvestment in new towns, they became the sort of places that people would rather, if they could afford to, live elsewhere. And so I want to sort of try to turn that around somehow. And I wonder what your thoughts are about that, you know, that heritage point and, you know, that importance of recognising them as heritage, really.
Thank you, and your exhibition sounds excellent. Well, it's something actually that it's one of the reasons we set off in the original bit of research we did on this. We really wanted to try and change public opinion on the new towns, the positive aspects of it, as well as understanding the challenges and what can be done through those. And it's something we've been promoting through our policy work. But the APPG on new towns that I mentioned, we really hope that will have a really strong role in that, because there are parliamentary representatives of those new towns that are flying the flag for those, as it were. And one of the things the manifesto for that APPG has been asking government for is for there to have a minister to have within their portfolio responsibility for the new towns, because there's no ministerial responsibility for new towns at the moment, and they are a unique part of our history, but also our living urban development. So I think there's a few different ways. There's through the use of the arts, which I think is a really powerful way to engage people in it, through exhibitions and some of the creative activities that some of the new towns are doing. And I think at the national level, it's using tools such as the APPG to get those new town representatives to really advocate themselves, and to give people in the new towns voices as well. There's some great research projects which are taking historical voices from people who've grown up in new towns to talk about why they think their places are special. And we're going to be hosting some on our website the results of so the links to some, I can't remember the name of the project, New Jerusalem it's called, and it's about revealing the archives of the new towns. And I think there's about 20 new town archives involved in that, and over the next few years they're going to be encouraging and allowing access to the fantastic resources. I mean, it's the power of the images in some of the new town materials, I think, will capture people's imagination, I hope.
I just want to add, because I can't help myself, that if you go to Peterlee, if you in the car park where the Development Corporation was founded, there's this picture of Glassmore sculpture that someone's reversed into and is lying in two pieces on the ground. It's probably worth about 50 grand down here, but in Peterlee people are saying, can we put it in a skip? And it's a kind of, it's extraordinary. What I would just say in a wider sense is that it's interesting that the English are very uncomfortable about utopia, about that tradition. And there's always been a huge weight against people who have suggested that we can live better lives, almost as if that is an immense challenge to the status quo, because of course it is. And it's interesting, the garden cities suffered from it well. The new towns and people's response to new towns included a lot of snobbishness, because they were essentially built as working class communities. And I'm conscious that people's view of Letchworth was they branded it as sandal-wearing cranks. No, it's true. There were a lot of sandal-wearing vegetarians. First vegetarian secondary school, in the country was at Letchworth. And there was lots of pacifists, lots of people living alternative lifestyles, exploring different identities in Letchworth, when it was founded. But it's interesting, isn't it, why people are there's such a weight against that kind of opportunity. And the fact that at the heart of all of this is the moral foundation of town planning as a caring profession.
A couple of questions on the public participation element. What would public consent look like if it's for a new town in practice? What would count as consent? And what evidence do you think that there is that homeowners and landowners in the shires of England would consent, especially if you're using CPO powers to acquire their land at use value? Where's the evidence that that they would come forward and welcome Newtowns Corporation with open arms? And what if no one wants to? What if no one says yes?
Happily, have a go.
Okay, follow up.
Yeah. So there are two distinct phases, I think. I'm not going to distract by talking about the easy phase. What we've talked about when the town is founded is the extraordinary excitement of citizens' assemblies in how the town develops, which could actually make it really a model of participative democracy. But that's the easy bit. The bit that you've raised is the hard bit. So let's deal with the components of it. Firstly, landowners will never agree. I'm really not worried about them. And what I'm worried about actually is that if you're going to have a designation process, what you need to do is to have a process which is respectful and democratic in all regards. But in a small nation, ultimately, so attempts by this government to squash voices and to fail to engage because, they're going to be hostile. We've decided to disrespect you before it's even started. We're not even going to try to have a conversation with you. We're simply going to impose on you. I have more confidence in people. Of course, the only way is Westminster is a real problem. I have more confidence that, like Milton Keynes, you can say to people there's a choice. And it's not a choice between no development, is it? And a new town. The choice is between what we've now got in the MPPF, which is appeal-led housing, imposed on people without the infrastructure, at very poor quality, everywhere, all at once, that will anger everybody, or the Milton Keynes decision to say in Buckinghamshire, you know what, we will agree to this way of resolving this issue strategically for 2 or 3 generations. But what if people still say no? What if people say, up yours, we're not having it? Well, ultimately, then there has to be a democratic process. But you need a robust public inquiry. People need their voice. You need to reach out and have the conversation. And ultimately, for a national project like that, Parliament would decide with a parliamentary vote, right? That's how that would operate. Personally, I am more confident in people, but I'm an old romantic, that you'll be able to have a conversation with them. But I'm absolutely clear that this isn't an option of no growth, no nothing happening. This is an option about doing it really well strategically or not. And that is a compelling argument. And I've been in local authorities where that argument really did work. And if there'd been an effective New Towns programme, they probably would have gone for it. Think about North Essex, or you think about other authorities who've tried to have a conversation about scale growth, but of course have always been hit by the private sector saying, well, we'll build it. And then people say, a bit like the awful case in Oxfordshire, in West Oxfordshire, where people voted for 2,500 new homes, so long as there was zero carbon. And then a very famous developer comes along and says, you know what, now we've got that, we can't do the zero carbon bit, so up yours community will just build the 2,500 homes, and public trust is kind of destroyed. So I think people will come to an extent, but ultimately Parliament decides whether I like it or not. But don't pretend you can disrespect people, it's always a mistake.
I think you've hit on as well, just that word trust. It's part of that wider. Throughout planning, there is a real distrust. Throughout the country, there's a real distrust in planning and development because people have been subjected to, in the main, such poor quality development for decades, and there hasn't been these means of participation, which is why we're really adamant that there needs to be this national conversation about why we need homes and where they need to be, and that there needs to be an honest and transparent process of identifying locations and an evidence-based process so people can understand why decisions have been made instead of assuming that they are going to be against them.
Well, I very much enjoyed your talk, not only, or maybe a lot, because I'm also researching the period and the architecture of inner city Lambeth and of the 60s and 70s. And my question would be for you, how I'm also trying to learn from it and for the future. My background is architecture. I'm a practicing architect. And the people and the Louis Silken, the department of the government departments and the people are not known and or are not. You were saying yourself that it's a totally unthinkable concept at the moment that the government could fund housing and could one? How would you write it? Take the history forward by explaining a bit more what those people did and who were the key actors, not only Louis Silken and the Development Corporation and some key architects. There must be like a super good example. I mean, Milton Keynes, of course, is being researched, but telling the story so simple that even government understands it.
That's a challenge.
Yeah. We're working on a play.
And a musical.
And a musical. But in all seriousness, sorry, I was just going to say, one of the things we've found to be really powerful when trying to change minds is actually taking people to see places. And we used to do lots of study tours across the UK and internationally. And there is nothing more powerful than taking somebody to see what is possible and what can be better, to really encourage them to campaign for that in their area. A number of local committee members that have been we've taken to various places around Europe who have suddenly now become convinced that they can do zero carbon housing and it can be better is really good. So we've been doing study tours around the new towns, but there's no substitute for actually taking people to see places. So I think continuing to promote that.
I don't think I'm just really finally that, in terms of what inspired, there are figures out there, of course, that are recognised in research as being, the critical political and economic figures behind it. But it was poets who were most important. It was Priestley in the war that reframed the debate about the future and said, if we're going to pay this price, we must have a better future, at which people are at the heart of that. And it was Aneurin Bevan as Minister of Health who had responsibility for housing in the first instance, who made this extraordinary speech where he said, this isn't going to be, the private sector is an unplannable instrument, he said. So we are going to do this. And he said in his speech, we are going to reach out and house those most in need first. And those who depend on private market housing can wait until those most in need have been supplied. And it was that sense of moral force behind it which captured the nation. And although there were local objections, there was a general sense of a unified national programme of wanting to deliver better lives for the sacrifice that's been paid down. I suspect very much that what will happen is that, this government's agenda on imposing stuff that we've heard a lot about today will fail because people bite back when they're imposed on really hard. But I'm fascinated to see how that the case for new towns shifts, partly about health, partly about utopia, but it will also, of course, be about the climate crisis. So within 20 to 30 years, we'll be rehousing tens of thousands of people from vulnerable places. And then we will be having a new debate about how to do that. And in that context, it will be very much more like the Mark I new towns than we are in the current formulation. But at the heart of it, the case is always cultural. It's always artists that make the difference.
And let's not forget the female voices as well.
Yeah.
Some of the work we've been doing on the forgotten pioneers of the garden cities and new towns movement, because some of the names that spring to mind are quite often male, and we've been doing some work to try and promote some of those forgotten voices that had a really important role to play.
So just a final question from me then. Imagine that you wake up tomorrow, the sun is shining, it's 23 degrees, you're feeling really, really positive. What do you think the government can realistically achieve in this Parliament on its current track?
Brilliant. Katy!
Well, I'm going to be positive. You know, you read the website of the New Towns Task Force. They are committed to large scale. They are committed to quality. They're committed to considering renewal of existing places and the creation of new ones. And we heard from Angela Rayner just last year about the quality and the healthy types of places that we want to build. So it is within government's power to do that. You know, if we can identify some areas of search, perhaps they can identify a location for 1 or 2 new towns in this parliament. They could even get to the point of designating within 4 years. But if they really got their acts together, they could go even further than that. I'm going to be positive.
I like that answer. Very good. Thank you very much for your contributions this evening, and thank you to everybody here for your great questions. I think it's been a lively debate. I think there have been some very interesting points raised. If we could just thank Katy and Hugh again in the traditional manner.